When you think of Peaky Blinders, you probably picture razor blades sewn into caps, foggy Birmingham streets, and a ruthless family building an empire through violence. But behind that image lies a story far bigger than a single gang. The real story of the Peaky Blinders is about how street gangs gradually transform into institutional empires. It shows how crime uses business, finance, and power to survive and expand. When you look closely, this journey runs almost parallel to the evolution of capitalism itself. In the beginning, gangs that survived through petty theft and protection rackets were actually teaching the earliest lessons of finance, extracting value from the weak and turning it into power. The real Peaky Blinders were not the stylish, charismatic figures portrayed on television. In the late 19th century, Birmingham was a city boiling with industry and poverty. Thousands of young men, returning soldiers, or those too poor to find steady factory work, joined gangs simply because they had no other options. The Peaky Blinders were one of these groups. Most of them were barely out of their teens. Their weapons were belts, knives, and fists. Their goal was not boardrooms, but control of the streets. Their first businesses were gambling dens, street theft, and collecting protection money from local shopkeepers. Economically speaking, they were running the most basic form of a financial system, pulling wealth from those who couldn't defend themselves. But over time, the story changed. In the early 20th century, England was modernizing. The police became more organized, and street violence was no longer enough to guarantee survival. Gangs had to adapt. This is where the economic dimension truly entered the picture. Crime became a business. The Peaky Blinders and similar groups began laundering their money through pubs, clubs, and betting operations. They bought influence over politicians, police officers, and businessmen. Using contracts, shell companies, and investments, they hid their profits. What looked like chaos on the streets was actually an early phase of corporate strategy. This wasn't unique to Birmingham. Across the Atlantic, organized crime in America followed the same path. Italian and Irish gangs in New York and Chicago learned the same lesson. Violence can seize territory, but finance builds empires. During Prohibition in the 1920s, some gangs made staggering amounts of money. But the smart ones reinvested their earnings. They moved into legitimate businesses, breweries, transportation companies, nightclubs, and controlled the entire chain from production to distribution. They looked like gangsters, but they operated like corporations. Even though the Peaky Blinders as a gang eventually disappeared from Birmingham, the model they represented, crime transforming into business, never vanished. In the 1930s, new groups like the Sabinis and Messinas took over racetrack betting and built sophisticated financial networks. They hired accountants and lawyers, kept books, and relied not just on brute force but on intelligence and organization. They understood that real wealth wasn't the cash in your pocket, but assets, investments, and influence. At this point, it becomes clear how blurred the line between crime and business truly is. The Peaky Blinders may have started with street fights, but their successors sat at the same tables as bankers, investors, and politicians. Money laundered through gambling looked a lot like capital raised for factories. Debts collected through threats were not so different from contracts enforced through courts. The difference was mostly the mask, and this pattern repeats throughout history. Street gangs become organized crime. Organized crime becomes business. Business merges with government. What begins as survival in a slum turns into control over systems that shape millions of lives. The lesson of the Peaky Blinders is simple. Violence lays the foundation, but finance builds the empire. Global examples tell the same story. In Chicago, Al Capone built his empire during Prohibition through intimidation, protection rackets, and territorial control. But his real strength wasn't just violence. It was organization. He kept records, paid salaries, and invested in legitimate businesses. His accountants knew exactly how to move smuggling profits, bribes, and restaurant or real estate investments. Capone's empire wasn't a gang, it was a company. In Japan, the Yakuza followed a similar path. What began in the 17th century as outcast gamblers evolved into corporate syndicates by the 20th century. They wore suits, opened offices, printed business cards, and invested in construction, finance, and entertainment. They even took on state-like functions, resolving disputes, enforcing contracts, and providing credit. In Latin America, drug cartels perfected this model. They started as small smuggling groups and evolved into vertically integrated organizations, controlling production, transportation, and distribution. Cocaine, marijuana, heroin, these weren't random products. They were handled like goods of a multinational corporation. They laundered billions, invested in real estate and agriculture, and even moved into technology. They hired lawyers, accountants, and public relations experts. Like the Peaky Blinders, they blurred the line between gangster and businessman until the two became indistinguishable. The lesson is clear. Organized crime and corporate capitalism often operate on the same logic. Accumulate wealth, consolidate control, and expand influence. Black market operations can be reinvested and eventually legitimized. Yesterday's gang can become today's billionaire. The cycle repeats because the core motivation never changes. For us today, the takeaway is this. When looking at the corporations that dominate the global economy, we should ask harder questions about their origins and methods. Many of the world's largest companies were not founded on spotless stories. Some grew through monopolistic practices, some through labor exploitation, others by bending or bypassing the law. The difference between criminal and corporate often comes down to who gets to write the rules. Today, many massive corporations wield more power than governments. They influence laws, finance political campaigns, and shape global trade. Their empires are no longer protected by razor blades sewn into hats, but by legal contracts and lobbying firms. Yet the dynamic is the same, controlling the flow of money, goods, and influence. There is also a psychological lesson here. The Peaky Blinders understood that fear is a form of capital. If people fear you, they pay you. In modern economies, fear still functions as capital. FOMO fuels speculative bubbles. Fear of default raises interest rates. Fear of instability justifies bailouts. The tactics are subtler, but the principle is unchanged. Fear creates leverage. The truth is, the world never truly escaped the Peaky Blinders' logic. It just put on a suit. Violence and finance are different stages of the same empire. First you control territory, then contracts, then governments. That is the road from street gang to corporate empire, and it has shaped much of economic history. The next time you look at a skyscraper bearing the logo of a powerful corporation, remember that many stories began in the shadows of streets like those of Birmingham. The lesson here isn't just about money or investing. It's about understanding how systems evolve, how power hides its origins, and how our economic history was written by both businessmen and street fighters. Real wealth isn't money, it's control. It's the ability to manage capital, influence, and legitimacy. The Peaky Blinders learned this on a small scale. Global corporations learned it on a massive one. And if you want to protect your own financial freedom, you need to understand it too. Don't be fooled by myths of clean money and dirty money. All money passes through the same system. What matters is who controls it, and whether you're in a position to protect yourself. The Peaky Blinders were never just a gang. They were a preview of the financial world we live in today.